Well, this feels like a reunion. There are many of you that I've worked with. Sometimes I'd have to say into the decades. Some of you we just spoke in the last 2 or 3 months with some presentations, whether it was out in Matsu or down in the Kenai area. So this is for those of you that have seen some presentations I've done in this last 6 months. This is a little bit of an overlap. There's no doubt about that. I also want to say I'm going to really shorten the data section, which is the part that Charles Udomo and I had been working on the last 2 years in some analysis, the User Risk Behavior Survey. And I'm doing that because you've already got a lot of data. You have quite a bit. And I also know that you've been working in this field for quite some time. So when it comes to what are the upstream prevention principles, I don't need to spend lots of time on it. What I learned a while ago was that if I jump right into something without giving context, it kind of is a little confusing to folks. So I'm going to speed through this first part, and then we'll get into what I call research to theory to practice. And there I want to spend a little time on, well, what are the different definitions we have with protective factors these days? And what are some of the core themes across our settings? And then some specific actions depending on how many questions you guys have. Okay, so here we go. Upstream prevention principles. So I always like to use this particular graphic. And if we think about that, these rocks right here, those represent the challenges that youth are facing, whether it's failing in school or fighting, feeling alone, substance misuse, and so forth. And what we want to do is when we think about going upstream, that means we're going way upstream and we're asking questions about, well, what about the parents? Do they have the access to the resources before they even started having children? What is their education level? And what about what's happening when children are quite young? What are their experiences? Are they adverse or are they positive? And then when we think about the early years in elementary school, what's happening there? What's happening with their families? What's happening with peers? And especially right here at the bend, what's happening in middle school? Because that's clearly where you guys lie with your work. So upstream prevention is about identifying the influences that contribute to the problem. The other piece is that we consider the social environments. This is a key principle. You know that already. I just, for history's sake, I like to say, in the old days, we used to only focus on individuals and thought if they just had enough information, they would stop doing those things. Well, we know that's not true. And that we are all so influenced by our relationships and by the places and spaces that we inhabit. And so that's where we really look carefully now at what are those influences, what are what we call the risk and the protective factors. The other piece I like to remind people of, and it has implications for programming later on, we'll talk about it, but it is this overlap of behaviors. There's the overlap of influences and there's the overlap of behaviors and the consequences of that, especially for some youth, not all. So we'll look at that in a little while. The last is, as a prevention principle, is please focus on the factors you can influence, not the ones that you can't. I mean, it may be a really important influence, but if you, through your programming, if you can't change school climate, then why are you focusing on that one, right? You're in an after-school program. All right, so let's just hop into a couple of quick definitions, put us all on the same page. Risk factors, when it comes to youth, are personal characteristics and external conditions and experiences that increase the chances of problems in the teen years. And protective factors, personal characteristics, external conditions, and positive experiences that help youth cope with challenges, some of those early risk factors, and it prevents problems from happening in the future. I put these little symbols at the bottom just as a reminder that, remember, they cut across behaviors and they cut across these different sectors. So I like to have this in mind. People remember that protective factors don't only help prevent problems, but they lead to positive outcomes. And so those are just a sample of some of those positive outcomes, what they might be. So in this work of what are the risk and protective factors most important to adolescent health? What we did initially, and I've been working on this for about 20 years, is we looked across these different behaviors here, okay? And when we did the research, we had to look at what specific areas. And in order to have some criteria, we decided that we had to first look at what a factor had to influence two of these behaviors, at least two. So for example, substance use, misuse, and violence, or substance misuse and depression, or unsafe sexual activity and violence. We were looking for two, and it had to be cited in at least two peer-reviewed journals, or it could be university studies, federal, state reports, or from national reputable organizations. And it was from all of that that we came up with this larger list of risk and protective factors. Now, you see, and I just put up that little, see your handout. We just sent out a handout to you earlier, and it has the full list that we came up with of the risk and protective factors that cut across these behaviors. But there are too many to deal with, right? I mean, there's 25 risk and 25 protective factors. So we got a good pushback, and that was that we need to put priority to them. So just before I go to the next slide, as a reminder, if you're interested in this literature review and the definitions and citations and all of that, you can find that at the bottom. You'll find that link, and I also reference it at the end. But let's zoom in a second. There are all kinds of lists of risk and protective factors, and depending on what area you're looking at, well, they may come up with their own. The ones that we selected for Alaska, because again, there was this pushback, 25 is too many, even if the research shows that. The pushback for us in the epidemiology group was, which are the ones that are going to be most important for Alaska's adolescents? So here was our priority process. Solid research foundation, of course, and that's, again, 2 peer-reviewed journals or more, and it had to cut across 2 behaviors. Had to be relevant for Alaska. It had to be changeable at the community level. So you couldn't pick poverty if you couldn't address poverty at a local level through a community coalition process, then it wasn't going to be the high priority. It was important, but it may not be something that could be changeable at the community level. And the last is there sufficient readiness or public will? And so based on that, we came up with a five risk factors and 6 protective factors. So we're going to go over these very fast. Here they are. And this is also in your handout, or the link to it, if this is of interest to you. They're the 4 behaviors we were looking at. Here are the actual risk factors. Those of you familiar with ACEs, this is obviously the ACEs area, and across the 4 behavior areas. Okay, I want to switch because most of our time is going to be spent on protective factors. Okay, so here we are. Again, we're looking at breaking it out by individual, family, school, community. There are your areas on the top. Here are the ones that were priority. And we added feeling valued and mattering to others because when we looked at our own youth risk behavior survey and our data over the last 10 years, we found that feeling valued and mattering really had a significant influence across several of the behaviors. And I can show you that in a minute. But now's a quick second for me to say, you got any questions here before I jump into the other? Is it just research stuff? If not, I'll go into the data. Here we go. And I promise it'll be short. Okay. So we're going to look at measuring protective factors with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And my colleague, Charles Udamal, he was a data analyst with the public health, and he had analyzed the YRBS data for a decade or more. And the 2 of us looked at 7 protective factors that are measured on YRBS and the influence they have on 67 behaviors. And he has a paper, and it's down here, and I have it as a reference if you want to look at it. But the bottom line is, and this won't surprise any of us, the protective factors have an influence across most behaviors. But here's the big deal, and this is why I name my presentation More Matters. He found that while a single protective factor can reduce the prevalence of a certain behavior, it is the additional protective factors across settings that makes the most difference. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. And we'll look at that by looking at the feeling sad and hopeless here indicator with the YRBS. So we're going to look at, as I said, sad and hopeless. We're looking at traditional high school students, 2019, and we're going to compare the prevalence with and without different protective factors, okay? So again, this is the percentage of students who in the past year felt so sad and hopeless every day for 2 weeks or more in a row that they stopped doing the usual activities. The prevalence among the traditional population is 38%. Now, when we make this comparison, what happens when we look at the presence of these protective factors? Okay, overall, there it is, 38%. That's, I just put this on a bar graph. If they do not have the protective factor feeling like they matter to people, it goes up to 51%. And if it's present, it is 25. It drops down to 25. If they don't have the protective factor of controlling emotions, it's up here again at 51, drops down to about 32. Here it is for remaining calm. Here it is for supportive adults. Here it is for after school. Caveat to this, we know that the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is for high school students. I get that. And yet you are working with middle school students and you generally don't have this kind of level of data. Some of you, there's an exception to that. I know out in Matsu, you're able to gather more data for your middle school students than some communities can. Yahoo. So this is sort of a on the horizon forecast of what it might look like, but it may be different for middle school population. So I can just tell you, this is what it is for the high school population. Okay. Now, remember I talked about more matters. Okay. 38%. Here it is of what the prevalence is. What happens if they have only 0 or 2 protective factors? Again, this is for the prevalence of being sad or hopeless. Goes up to 56 if you've only have 2, but my gosh, if you've got 5 or 7, it drops down to 19.6. So I'm going to stop and just say, any questions about this data? Because that's all I'm going to present about data, because you've got a lot already. What does Will put in that chat? He always has something to say, I know.
Nothing yet, but I will say that if you are toggling between the 2 handouts, the data handout titled Alaska Cannabis Prevention version 1, with those data, we in the fact sheet we're using, we say supports as opposed to protective factors, and maybe we could think about that language. But when we say support, we're saying sort of those external environmental supports, and using that language in the same way that Becky, you use there with PF or protective factors.
You know, I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, and I'm glad you brought that up. I wish I could have dug into that report a little more. I was excited to see it. I saw there's a little bit of different terminology, but we're all adults. We can figure this out. We just kind of need a little help. Yeah, it's like, okay, they're talking external, here's internal. All right. So moving to action. This is where I want to spend more time. Review of protective factor terms, just like what you were talking about, Eliza, there. Foundations and core themes of the who, how, and the facilitation. Embed in your brain this pie chart, okay? Because we're going to fill that in. And this is what I call just some core things to remember. Again, we're going to look, we hope, at some selected protective factors, given there's enough time, and we're going to look at these particular 3. All right, let's jump into terminology. Okay, so with protective factors, look at that little, the little symbol up above. There's the external and there's the internal, right? Well, some terms refer to both and some refer to just one of them. So let's go over them. Let's talk about resiliency. Now, there's kind of some confusion around that. We throw it around a lot. We have resilient environments and resilient economies and so forth. Well, okay. I'm going to talk about the mental health and the social work fields as they think about resilience, all right? And so its definition in general is the ability to cope with and learn from adversity. Some people say it's the ability to be able to bounce back. It is an internal quality. So it goes right up in the middle of that donut up there. It's an internal quality. It's based, while it can be innate, it can also be taught. And that's very exciting. And we've got all kinds of research that shows that. And I want to jump ahead one slide, see if I can do this, to just give you an example. Let's see if this does it for me. Oh, good, cool. Inner strengths. What does resilience look like? If you are in a position where you say, hey, we really want to focus on resilience, well, then you're going to go, okay, well, it's an ability to be able to cope and bounce back. Well, how do we measure that? How do you define that some more? What I would do is I would encourage you to look at this work by Bonnie Bernard. It's older, but nonetheless, it's just got good core foundation. It's resiliency. What have we learned from WestEd? It's based on the Emmy Werner and Bruce Smith Kauai studies. And she's been around for quite a long time. She works in California. They have developed, and actually I know, Matt Sue, you have some of the surveys that you use are based on some of Bonnie Bernard's work. In any case, what does it look like? It's across the top here, it's having social competence, problem-solving skills, a sense of autonomy, and sense of purpose. And then there's your definitions. I'm not going to spend the time going into this anymore, but I just wanted to bring this back to you as a resource for you in the future. Okay. So that's resiliency. The next one is youth developmental assets. This comes from the Search Institute. It looks at the internal qualities and the external support. So it looks at both the inside of the donut and outside the donut. I shouldn't use donut if we're trying to be healthy, right? Oh, well. But in any case, this is a term that's been used quite a bit. Those of you that have been working with Derek Peterson and Brightways, you'll also know you'll be looking at integrative youth development. I don't have that up here at the moment, but it's again looking at internal qualities, external supports. Youth development approaches, often associated with Karen Pittman. We'll talk about a little bit more, but we're really looking at what do you do externally here? Let me get it up there. Externally, what are the approaches? What do you do to change the environment to help develop young people? Positive climate, my goodness, we're seeing this throughout in schools. We need to have positive school climates, but we also are thinking about how do we have that in out of school programs, or how do we have that in faith-based settings? And so this concept of climate is very much of what is that feeling when you walk in the door? Does it feel warm, or does it feel like, oh, I don't want to be here, and oh, everyone's yelling and there's chaos, and I've just come from a really chaotic environment and I can't handle this. What does that environment look like? So that it is a protective factor term we use as well. Positive childhood experiences is coming more into the terminology these days because it's coming from the trauma prevention field. We looked only at ACEs. Now people are saying, well, we have to look at the positive experiences too. And no kidding. I would be remiss not to mention the positive psychology movement that started back in the, probably 70s, maybe 80s with Marty Seligman. And there's a whole outgrowth of thinking and work in that field. And so you'll hear this positive psychology sometimes. It's very much related to protective factors. Often more of the internal, I would say, though. And lastly, many of Alaska's traditional values inside and ways and traditions, I think, are really overlap with this protective factor work. So I hoped that this, just giving you a quick overview of this, may help put some pieces together when you sometimes hear people use these different terms. All right, so on to some foundations. Whoops, it decided to switch on me. When we look at this pie, if you can remember, the green is always, we're looking at the setting, okay, or the climate. And the red area is looking at your who is facilitating all of this, right? And the doing what? Well, often that's what you get paid to do. It's whether it is a STEM activity, whether it's arts, whether it is culture, whether it is athletics, whether it is academic enrichment. it's not only the what, it's the how. And that's what we're going to jump into. So we're going to look at some core foundations for some of these pieces here. So one of the core themes is positive youth development. It's very much the how. It comes from this work of Karen Pittman's of problem free is not fully prepared. And in our world, this means that it isn't just enough. Like you could have young people that, all right, they know some skills, but they don't have a chance to practice them. They need to be fully engaged. So our job, especially in after school programs, is how can we provide them with the experiences and opportunities so they can practice and they can make mistakes. So what does this look like? This is going to look a lot like good best practices in after school through the network that you're going to hear about a little later. But just overview, positive youth development, it focuses on capacities and strengths, not on just their problems. It looks beyond, it looks for their potential. And it begins with the support of adults and a positive setting. Yes, there it is. But the how part is part of these core beliefs. All youth are capable. All youth are to be respected. Youth should have a say. We call that the voice and the choice and ability and opportunities to help make decisions. And that there are program opportunities for skill building, for leadership, for being able to contribute. And not just in the program setting itself, but maybe outside of the program too. And that there are ways that you and your programs can help expand their horizons. Again, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record because you're going to hear this said in different ways because these are the foundations. The last is a positive youth development approach also recognizes and knows that children go through big transitions. Some we can plan for and some we can't, whether it's going from elementary school to middle school to high school, or it may come because a parent has left or a family member has died. And we have some young people that have their families are in transition and moving and maybe homeless. Whatever they are, this person, this supportive adult that's in here is the one that's keeping an eye on all of this and reaching out accordingly. So I want to spend a moment on this question of who are you serving? And to answer that question, or maybe not answer the question, but to pose something for you to think about is looking at what, remember, I called the overlap of behaviors. So we're going to look at these behaviors, these health behaviors, fighting, failing in school. These are the ones maybe you see more in middle school. You may see some early substance misuse. There could be later on unsafe sexual activity and again, or suicide ideation. We were looking at these specific behaviors, and we being Charles and myself. And here's what we found for the high school population. That about half of the students were in the 0 to 1 of these behaviors. That's pretty good news. Most youth are not involved in these things, okay? They could be. Maybe they're not doing so well in school, all right? That would be one, all right? Maybe they got into a fight at one time. But here, if we go around the circle here, we're looking at about a quarter of them, a little over a quarter are involved in 2 or more of these. Here's where I get really concerned. These up in here. We've got almost a quarter of students are involved in 3 or more of these. And look at this, 6% are involved in 5 or more. So what does that mean for you? Well, I know these are high school students, and I know you're serving middle school students, but here we go, right? Remember, if we think of these rocks being these behaviors down here, you're in the after school program here. You're in a prevention place. What I remember, I didn't put this as a principle, but a prevention principle is also you start your prevention work at least 2 years before the behaviors to initiate, at least 2 years. So where does that put you guys? You are right there in the fertile ground of prevention. So if we want to, and yet I know that your middle school students, the ones that you may be seeing, or elementary school, may well be coming from homes of trauma. And so they may be starting more experimentation in these areas. Okay, I'm going to shift now, but I want to see if there's any questions, because now I'm going to go into a couple of protective factors. Okay, here we go. All right. So one of the protective factors has to do with supportive adults. All right. And it's defined in different ways. The way, though, that it is looked at, I mean, there is an external kind of support of, oh, I'm in a friendly community. People know my name. That's cool. That's nice. They're smiling at me. The definition that we look at least with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and if we want to go deeper, we look at it's when young people feel they can go to someone if they had a problem. So it's not to say that having a supportive community isn't important. It is important. If you want to get closer, then what I would really encourage people to do is take a look at the developmental relationship framework from the Search Institute. And so it really gets into some of the very specific, the how-tos of, well, what does that look like if I really want to be more of a supportive adult? And believe me, this does not have to be just in an after-school setting. It can be, you know, it could be your neighbor, it could be your friends' children, it could be your children's friends that you could be the supportive adult to. It can be in your faith community. But I'm just going to tick through these really quickly, but I would encourage you that if you think this is important and you want to go that extra push for being that supportive adult, here's just a couple of things. So one, here are the qualities and then what it looks like. So the first one is show that you care. And this means that you put down your phone and you really give attention when they're asking you or you're talking to them. So you're listening, you're dependable. When you say you're going to do something, by golly, you do it. And you get to know them. You get to know them and what their interests are. The second one is, and I'm going through this fast, a second quality is that you challenge their growth. This means that you're encouraging them, you're helping them learn through their mistakes. Another is this idea of providing support, but this is on two layers. There's the one, yeah, help me achieve my goals. It's the emotional support, and it's also the, stuff is looking kind of hard. You need some help thinking through this and going over the pros and cons, and even thinking about, well, are there some things that are some barriers and how do you want to work through this? But it's being there in dialogue. You can't challenge growth or provide that kind of support unless a young person knows that you really care. Okay, sharing power. And we talk about this lots in our after school programs in that we say, hey, make sure that you involve young people in decisions. Make sure that they have a say in things. Ask and consider it. And the last is expanding possibilities. So that is helping connect young people to people that are maybe in fields that are in their interests, or whether it's work or just something that's a hobby of theirs. I think I will hold off on that. I have a wonderful quote at the end, but all right. I want to switch to a resource that I developed this year. Thank you, Thomas, for your help. Down at the bottom, it says More Matters, Strategies to Increase Protective Factors Among Alaska Adolescents. I looked at the 5 or 6 protective factors and looked to see what's the best, how can we increase them? What specific actions? So what we did in this is looking at the after school setting with supportive adults. Here are just some really simple, straightforward ideas of what you do, whether it's, the names of all the youth, you look to understand what is their verbal and nonverbal communication style, know their interests. I think this is really important. When they start sharing ideas, stop, listen, and listen very carefully and ask some follow-up questions, which shows that you're really listening and that you care. I'll let you look at these and you can look at them in more detail later, especially if you go to this resource. Time is of essence, so I'm going to the next one. So the next one is this idea of mattering to others. And I know this seems really abstract, right? So I need to explain it and take a moment with it. It is an internal quality. right? So here it is. It's this idea of feeling valued and mattering to others. And the way I've come to explain it, having, I did a lit review just specifically on mattering, and then have worked with the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition as they were developing a program where they were trying to work with, and they worked with after school programs. Many of them are here, but they were looking at what are the ways that we can measure mattering as well. So before I show you that, I want to say that when I tried to describe this before, I realized that one way to do this is to compare it to plants or plant ecology. So mattering is kind of like a signal, just like fruit or flowers are a signal that something right is going on for that tree or that plant or that shrub. That it's the presence of a variety of environmental conditions that are going on. So for the plant, it would be the right amount of sun, the right amount of water, that the soil is full of the right nutrients. So what does that look like with mattering? Well, in this case, we're looking at this is going to sound familiar. What does the environment look like? What does that climate look like in that setting? Is it safe physically and emotionally? What's the connection I have with people there, not only with my peers, but also with the adult? Because if I don't feel like I can trust people, I'm not going to be comfortable there. Again, there's our voice, and here's the role of contribution. When I make a suggestion, does anybody listen? Does it make a difference? If I am doing a project out in the community, is it just because it's going to make us all feel good, or does it really feel like we're going to be able to make a difference for the people we're doing this project for? It is these ingredients is what leads to feeling valued and mattering. So pause, question. Okay, you guys.
No questions, Becky, but we did get a kudos that they loved the analogy, I think, in reference to the plant, the tree, the flowering.
Oh,
me too. I got lost in it in a good way.
You got lost in the, maybe one time I'll put up a graphic with, apples or something. No, I'll do something that's Alaska based. Okay. Next one, let's go ahead and look at, the mattering to others. And so what are the specific actions? Again, I'm using my More Matters document. And again, those are those 4 core elements. So the program has a youth advisory committee that helps make decisions. Okay, that helps contribute to it. There are youth-centered practices. There are youth help to co-create the rules, youth-led projects. Really simple. You'll find more of those again in More Matters, strategies to increase protective factors. Okay, Afterschool Essentials. Now I'm going to give you the most brief because this is your world. This is what Thomas works on in the whole after-school network. But I'm going to go right back to what I call sort of my core pie here, your setting, your support, and your how. So the setting, the essentials, 1, it's safe, it's welcoming, it's respectful, it's structured. It's got to be structured if it's going to be trauma informed. It has to be predictable. There's enough things going on of chaos that if there isn't some structure there, it can make it just more difficult for those young people that have experienced trauma or are currently. When we look at at the how, I'm going to go the other way around at the how. Again, PYD focus, youth-centered practices of voice and choice and leadership, that the activities are safe. And I'm sure that you guys know what that should mean by now, but as a reminder, it's sequenced, it's active learning, it's focused, and it's explicit. I know Thomas has probably drummed this into you quite a bit. I like to make sure to remind people of the skills and the activities. They've got to be culturally age appropriate, ability appropriate, and gender appropriate. We've got to remember this appropriateness. And do you remember when we went back and we looked at that pie that showed that half of youth are really doing okay, but we had about a quarter of them have all kinds of things going on. Think about what their experiences are, and is the activity appropriate? Do they need additional supports? And the last is this idea of dosage. Again, I'm assuming that Thomas has talked with you about that, and that we cannot expect that youth are going to learn skills and have the kind of outcomes if they aren't there, and if they don't come regularly, and if there isn't enough intensity. Again, he can spend more time on that one. And the final is that, of course, ongoing training for qualified staff, which is, yay, what the after school network is all about, and the YPQ training that you're going to have available. So the resources, what a surprise, the after school network and the YPQI. The way I have framed all of this, whether it is in an after school setting, or even think about in your own home, what does your own setting look like? How is it that you provide support and stay centered but not get too hooked? And then the very much how of how we give our young people some power and an opportunity to practice and make some mistakes. That's the kind of thing that will help build those internal protective factors. Okay, just a few quick things. I've told you about this prevention brief. Here it is. And it's also part of the handout. I make reference to these with links, but so that you know, many of the ideas, most of the ideas all came from our Alaska Healthy 2030 plan, the Transforming Schools framework, the good old book, Helping Kids Succeed Alaska Style, that looked at what are the actions any of us can do. And then the new book from booklet or publication from the School Board Association, Stronger Together, has some fabulous resources that aren't just about school family partnerships. So in any case, this little publication or this booklet, whatever we want to call this resource, it's got a lot of resources, and the push for it was, Becky, we've got the data, we understand that, yeah, you can tell us the theory of what we should do, but what does it look like? And so that's why I put that together. And I'll tell you what, it's a first draft, so make it better and give some more suggestions. All right, so here's a reference to those. And before I end with more questions, if you guys have any questions, I want to end with this quote. It's not really a quote, but it's a study that was done in rural Alaska, and it was looking at the high suicide rates in one particular region. And in order to explore what was going on in the communities, some researchers went out and they had interviews with young people and with adults about what they thought was going on. They interviewed people in 12 different villages. And the question was, what do you think is the main cause of suicide among youth in your villages? Okay. The adults replied, they said they were more likely to say that it was the lack of organized activities. That's what was to blame. They just need to do more stuff out there. We need to have more activities. And yet the young people, what they said is they asked for, I get choked up, as you can tell. What they asked for was more meaningful interactions with the adults on everyday basis. It's not just doing more stuff. It's being really present. So whether that's being present on the street with them, whether that's being present with them in your after school program, take the phone, put it down, be present. Sorry, I didn't know that would get me that time. Anyway, this was as fast as I could version of the More Matters presentation. With a little bit of data, you've got a whole bunch more that I know is there in your the publication. And I've got more too if you wanted to see it, but enough of the data. How about some questions? And I can turn on chat now.
Yeah, just been loading up all the resources you've been putting in as the
Oh, good. Thanks.
We have the live links as well. Any questions from the group or comments from the group?
While you're thinking, just FYI, related to the Helping Kids Succeed book, there's a downloadable version that the Association of Alaska School Boards, it will send you to a link that goes to Amazon. And I don't know if somebody said, oh yeah, right, thanks. That's the old book. The new one is quite colorful, and you can look at it online. But I tell you, if somebody said, I really just want a hard copy, send me a note. I think I have probably 3 or 4 of them, or no, I lie. I probably have a dozen, 2 dozen, a box full. Okay, I admit it, left over. Okay, any other questions? Or questions at all?
Hi, this is Tyler in Matsu. I always enjoy your presentation very much. Thank you. I could listen to this again and again. I really appreciate your focus on the after-school programs. What advice do you have for you in terms of what's happening in our programs? What advice do you have for programs to expand these ideas out to families in the wider community? I think that's a common frustration amongst programs, and I know my staff of, well, we're doing all this stuff, but the parents don't seem to care, et cetera. So I know it's not necessarily a research-based question, but I was curious if you had any best practices about expanding this beyond the walls of our programs.
Well, I think, well, first of all, there's a publication that was done, a decade plus ago, that talked about some of the key features of after-school programming is connection with parents. And so they talk about some of that outreach, that it has to be there. All right, theory. I think that if you took a look at that publication, let me go back, hold on. If you look at Stronger Together, Power of Partnerships, as I recall, there may be some ideas in there. The other thing is, when I was pulling together this book, again, I call it a book. It's not a book. It's only like 12 pages, But anyway, I found some resources that would talk about, let's say it's supportive adults, and you're wanting to figure out how can you, in an after-school program, be reaching out for more adults, or how can you do that as a parent? How can you find other supportive adults that are safe, of course? So there's some ideas in there. And so I would noodle around in that and then check out these resources here. That may help you. I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you like a specific, but I remember there were some fabulous links and ideas. Oh, and thinking about like, what is it that families can do? There were some wonderful ideas, ones that any of us that still have children at home, we could pull this one off. And probably even more important with our COVID challenges, to look at how we do that.
I will say, and this is not to be a push, Tyler, and that, but some of it is as well. When we think of our families, it's not that they don't care and that they don't want to do this. It's that they may not have the knowledge, skills, resources, or information to be able to embrace or connect.
Or time, yeah.
Where we've had the ability and luxury and privilege of engaging in Becky's fantastic training. Some of us multiple times. That's some of these are new concepts, and if you don't know what you don't know, or if you yourself have been brought up in a toxic environment, you may not know what those strategies are to put in place. You may want to break some of the challenges that you've experienced as of yourself, but not knowing how to do it with your own child. The one piece that really resonated with me, and I know we're at time, so if folks need to jump off, you're welcome to jump off. We do have this recording going. The part that really stood out for me too is around the skill appropriateness that you're talking about, Becky, and in particular around when we're thinking of this idea around gender, around culture, around ability, age. I think for me, this is where we really see an inequity inside of our field, or where we sometimes can push towards, instead of looking at that deficit, trying to focus my positive youth development hat, think of equity focus. And I think this is an area of growth in our field where we are wrestling with what this looks like. How do we not just offer, this is the class that we offer to everyone, but how do we give the right supports and coaching mechanisms and resources to be able to allow youth who may not have the right skill set that we think, or that was kind of developmentally what we imagine for the young person. How do we build those supports and that scaffolding in place to allow that young person to fully engage and benefit from the activity? And I think this is very true throughout Alaska, where we run into these issues around equitable access to out-of-school time programming. And when we are thinking of it and coming back from COVID as well, and young people's ability to have social engagements that might have been something that was no problem before, but after a year and a half of isolation, that might be a struggle for them.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. That is kind of that little corner there of where I think some of the equity work can be done. And thinking about doing it very, very intentionally. Yeah. A lot more to be said, but I know we're at past time. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that one up. And thanks for letting me have a reunion with you guys. It's fun. It's fun to see your faces again. Thanks. And I'm around. I am retired, so I do all this. Most all of it is volunteer. So if I'm not quite as responsive, it's hey, I went out for a mountain bike ride. Anyway. Thank you. And to the evaluators, if there is a conversation or opportunity for a conversation around some of the work you've been doing, I would absolutely love that too. So I toss that out there to Eliza, and I think it's Susan, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Becky, as always, for joining us. Thank you for all your work leading up to this grant program, even being developed and emerging, and you may not realize it, but you are the reason that we are.
Oh, stop it.
So thank you so much for everything.
Okay.
If you have any follow-up questions too, you're welcome to go to Becky directly, or you're welcome to connect with us and we can help connect as well.
Okay. Bye, everyone.